mean, in American universities, it's very useful.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Raimund Schwager Lecture 2019. Were founded in 2004 in memory of Raimund Schwager, SJ, living from 1935 to 2004. He was a prophylactic theologian, inspiring teacher, and one of the founding fathers of COV&R, and also its first president. The lecture series started first as a series of lectures here at the University of Innsbruck, promoting the discussion of and engagement with issues of religion and politics in our globalizing world. For the first time, the lecture took place also outside of Innsbruck as part of the annual COV&R conference at Riverside in 2008. In 2012, it was the last time that a Raimund Schwager lecture took place here in Innsbruck, then held by William COV&R as part of an interdisciplinary conference on the European Wars of Religion. We are very happy that after a break of 7 years, today a Schwager lecture again can take place here in Innsbruck, and we are very grateful to Imitatio, who graciously sponsors this lecture. Today's presenter of this lecture will be Nidesh Lahto, who speaks about the pathologies of exclusion, mimetic theory, crowd, psychology, and new fascism. Nidesh Lahto is assistant professor of philosophy and English at KU Leuven and principal investigator of Homo mimeticus, theory and criticism, and a transdisciplinary project situated at the crossroads between the faculties of arts, social sciences, and philosophy. Professor Lahto told me he will tell a little bit about that project as the beginning of his presentation. The project has received funding from the European Research Council under the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. Professor Lahto earned his PhD in comparative literature and critical theory from the University of Washington. He was maître assistant at the University of Lausanne from 2009 to 2013, visiting scholar in the Humanities Center of Johns Hopkins University from 2013 to 2016, and assistant professor at the University of Bern 2016 to 2017. He is the editor of Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Contemporary Thought from 2012, author of The Phantom of the Ego, Modernism and the Mimetic Unconscious, 2013, Conrad's Shadow, Catastrophe, Mimesis and Theory in 2016, and his recent book, New Fascism, Contagion, Community, Myth, is forthcoming in August 2019 at MSU Press. Please welcome Professor Lahto for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Dietmar, for this kind introduction. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to give this lecture, Raimund Schwager lecture. It's a great honor to be invited here today. Thanks to Imitatio as well for sponsoring the event. And above all, thank you all for coming out so late after such an intense day. That's a good illustration of devotion to the cause of mimetic theory. As Dietmar pointed out, this presentation is part of a bigger project titled Homo mimeticus, and since it is about imitation, I thought it would be useful to say a few words about the project in general before launching into the presentation. And so what the project does is really taking a step back to two founding figures of mimetic theory, Plato and Aristotle, who disagreed fundamentally on mimesis. Plato critiqued it because it triggers irrational behavior. Aristotle defended it and considered it rational and philosophical. So they disagreed on the value of mimesis understood as representation, and that is often emphasized. What is less emphasized is that they both fundamentally agreed that humans are mimetic animals. They agreed on that point. And so this ancient realization is at the center of the Homo Mimeticus project, and I explore it with my team from three different but related perspectives. One side is located more in the Faculty of Arts, and I'm looking at literary figures like Oscar Wilde, who argued that life imitates art more than art imitating life. So positing mimesis in life. But also having a look at contemporary science fiction movies in order to try to account for the ways in which new technologies are affecting mimetic behavior in the 21st century. So the idea there is to take case studies from literature, film, in order to theorize mimesis from a contemporary perspective. Another side is more philosophical in nature, and it's directly linked to the work of René Girard. I try to situate Girard in a contextual, philosophical tradition that has in Nietzsche, I would say, a major figure, and I try to trace genealogies that establish conversation, for instance, between Girard, Nietzsche, Georges Bataille, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, figures who also thought about mimesis and were kind of contemporaries, some of them, and were engaging in conversations, intellectual conversations with Girard. I'm thinking in particular of Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe. And some of the outputs of the philosophical side have appeared in Contagion. I'm worried about the debate between catharsis and contagion, for instance, with respect to new media. Do representations of violence generate cathartic effect, or do they actually contribute to spreading the violence they represent? And then a third sub-project deals with politics, I'm afraid. And this is not something that I had originally planned. I started applying for this grant in 2016, and I was based in the US. And when I had this interview with the ERC Council, we have 5 minutes to introduce 5 years of research. And so it occurred to me, they want to know why it matters, and they want to know it quickly. And so one of the things that I said off the cuff was, well, I'm coming from the US, and there are some kind of rising politicians who seem to understand mimetic behavior. And some of them laughed, but it seemed that worked out. So in any case, at the level of methodology, it's an interdisciplinary project. It adopts a genealogical approach, but the emphasis is really on the present. And I won't enter into the details of the project, but this is also to say that there is an interest in mimesis at the level of the European Research Council. So they're receptive to what we are doing at a conference like the one that we're having today. Why does imitation matter in the 21st century? Immigration would be a good topic for an ERC application, I would say. So if you're interested, do get in touch. I'll be happy to help. Just one last caveat. In order to apply for this grant, of course, I needed to show that I had done work before in mimetic theory, and I mentioned these 2 books that Dietmar already mentioned, not so much to talk about myself, but because they will kind of underscore the presentation that follows, but also because I would not have been in a position to apply for an ERC grant had it not been for the support of my editor, Bill Johnson, who is sitting here in front of us today. And since many of us have benefited from Bill's editorial skills over the years, it's not only my books, there are a number of books that are available on mimesis thanks to him. So I propose an applause to Bill Johnson for the work he's done over the last 10 years. All right, I think we are ready to start with the pathologies of exclusion, and I spell it with a dash, and I'll explain why I do so. Given the Nietzschean and Girardian inspiration of the diagnostic that follows, I might as well start with a personal confession, one that will not surprise mimetic theorists. The pathologies of exclusion I diagnose in this lecture are not completely original, just as the brackets around new fascism already indicate that the phantom of fascist egos is far from being completely new. My general wager, in fact, is that what the Greeks called enigmatically mimesis, or mimesis, depending on your national belonging, plays a decisive role in the pathologies of exclusion directed against racial, religious, and ethnic minorities. Mimetic pathologies that have striking analogies with what used to be grouped under the rubric of fascism. Although my thought is not theological in nature and is rather different from the distinguished figure that gives the name to this honorary lecture, I would like to pick up a question Raimund Schwager poignantly asked in his first book, which, in my view, has not lost any of its timeliness today. Namely, brauchen wir einen Sündenbock? Translated in the plural in English, do we need scapegoats? And if scapegoats are perhaps inevitable in times of crisis, what then is the logos that informs the pathos of exclusion, what I call Patho-logies? Born in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, I know that the accusation fascista comes with a heavy historical baggage and should not be used lightly, also because history does not repeat itself. But as a mimetic theorist, I also fear that if not fascism itself, then at least the phantom or shadow of fascism is back on the contemporary scene and requires renewed critical attention. If I take a step back to what used to be my main area of investigation, namely European modernism, I think it is safe to say that the link between fascism and mimetic behavior was once well known at the dawn of the 20th century. Imitation in its conscious and especially unconscious manifestations was then a popular subject of analysis. It concerned not only literature, philosophy, psychology, but also emerging human sciences such as sociology, anthropology, and especially crowd psychology, a discipline that provided a diagnostic of mimetic contagion fascist leaders like Hitler and Mussolini were quick to put to political use and abuse. And yet, as the phantom of fascism eventually dissolved in the second half of the 20th century, the shadow of mimesis and its legendary power to trigger unconscious and violent affects in the crowd progressively fell to the background of the theoretical scene. With few exceptions, it was eventually relegated to an aberrant historical anomaly that concerned a few European countries that had openly embraced fascist governments, most notably Italy and Germany. This, at least, is the story that is often told in school and is likely to be passed on still today, preserving the reassuring feeling that fascism belongs to a dark European past or enlightened age long left behind. And yet, this theoretical neglect did not prevent the laws of imitation from continuing to operate in political practice. Since humans remain, for better and worse, eminently mimetic creatures who are formed, informed, and transformed by dominant models, including political models, it is not surprising to see that as authoritarian leaders on the far right are elected in times of economic crisis, political instability, and intensified displacements of populations across national borders, the shadow of fascism falls once again on the political scene. In the process, it generates hyper-nationalist, militarist, racist, and xenophobic reactions that are not deprived of mass appeal, and in fact, relations between self and others, natives and immigrants, those who are considered the same and those who are considered different. Such hierarchical distinctions are constitutive of what Umberto Eco calls eternal fascism, whose features include, among other things, the cult of tradition, fear of difference, appeal to a frustrated middle class, machismo, and an impoverished language or newspeak we are now all too familiar with. If the term populism is often still used to designate this phenomena, which are actually phenomena that work against the people, Recent publications in the last 2 years have been pushing for a shift in terminology to account for these far-right movements, be it under the rubric of tyranny, aspirational fascism, neo-fascism, new fascism, or more simply, fascism. Influential historians, political theorists, philosophers, and cultural critics have recently reopened the dossier on fascism from a contemporary perspective. These books, some of which have just appeared or are forthcoming, are currently multiplying approaches to render visible a protean, chameleon-like, and in this sense, mimetic phenomenon that may not have a unitary essence or definition. It's very tricky to define fascism, but takes on different forms and colors to fit national backgrounds. Mimetic theory, I strongly felt, should be part of this chorus of dissident voices. Having previously diagnosed the effective power of fascist leaders in the past century, I felt somehow the obligation to add a mimetic supplement to diagnostics of contemporary politics in the present century. As the subtitle of New Fascism suggests, I propose to revisit 3 related mimetic concepts: contagion, community, and myth, in order to show that they played a key role in the rise of fascist phantoms that may not be completely new, yet effectively use new media to come to power. By placing brackets around the new, I intended to introduce a moment of suspension or hesitation with respect to books I sensed were soon to come, to remind ourselves that mimesis is an old concept and that what appears to be new at first sight might be a contemporary reenactment of ancient or modern principles mimetic theorists have long been familiar with. An idea already internal to the genealogy of the Italian concept of fascio, which harkens back to the imitation of ancient Roman power or will to power. These preliminary remarks are meant to indicate that in this lecture I won't be primarily concerned in justifying the relevance of the concept of fascism to account for the racism, hypernationalism, machismo, militarism, denial of facts, celebration of phallocentric power at play in far-right movements today, both in Europe and the US. For the number of recent books on the subject are already doing that. Nor will I have time to discuss the centrality of the 3 main concepts I investigate in New Fascism. For the book will come out in August with the Breakthrough in Mimetic Theory series, and if you're interested, you can find out soon. Instead, I would like to take the topic of this conference, Imagining the Other, as an occasion to step back to some of the foundational insights of mimetic theory, central to diagnosing the irrational trigger of mimetic contagion, which, as both Girard and Schwager taught us, can easily be directed against biblical scapegoats, and we should now add, against immigrants, minorities, and refugees as well. And the plenaries this morning have made this point very eloquently. In particular, I would like to establish a genealogical connection between 2 disciplines that are often still considered in isolation, most notably mimetic theory and crowd psychology, yet might benefit from being put in dialogue in order to account for the pathologies of exclusions that plague contemporary politics. On a more personal note, and to explain the case study of my lecture, I should also say that I started worrying against fascist phantoms and their return I diagnosed in The Phantom of the Ego around 2016, as I was working in the Humanities Center at Johns Hopkins University, a center Girard had helped to set up and render famous. It is perhaps also due to this genealogical connection that as Trump was gaining traction in the primaries, at a time many of my colleagues, perhaps more attentive to linguistic texts than to bodily mimicry, considered his candidacy a source of jokes. I started to take him seriously. Why? For many insights I owe to mimetic theory, but also because never had Nietzsche's prophetic diagnostic in the gay science rang truer than in 2016. Namely, that the most interesting ages of history always occur when actors, all kinds of actors, will be the real masters. Alle Arten Schauspieler, die eigentlichen Herren sind. He says it in the present. We live, I'm afraid, in these interesting but also dangerous ages. And if Nietzsche had the case of Wagner in mind, I could not resist the temptation to apply it to the case of Trump. I hope you'll forgive me for that. I just put my training as a literary critic to an orthodox use to diagnose these actors' rhetoric, but also to further mimetic theory from a political perspective. Building on Nietzsche, Girard, but also Georges Bataille, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, Jean-Luc Nancy, and other thinkers of mimesis, I wanted to better understand how, in a post-romantic era in which novelistic truth progressively gives way to digital and quite alternative truth, the shadows far removed from reality could produce unconscious and quite mimetic effects in real life. While the thinkers I mentioned provided the foundations on which I built, I also needed new concepts to further a diagnostic of mimesis in the 21st century. The mimetic unconscious, mimetic pathos, Patho-logies, mimetic racism, and hypermimesis are some of these concepts. I had been meditating over them for over the past decade, and I put them to critical use. So they will inform the diagnostic that follows, and I'll do my best to clarify them as I go along. But let us proceed in order by tracing a genealogical connection first. So the first section is titled The Genealogical Connection, Crowd Psychology, and Mimetic Theory. Much of what is currently displayed on the political scene, both in Europe and most visibly in the US, does not sound completely new to mimetic theorists. From the pathological narcissism of mediatized leader figures to the mimetic desires of followers modeled on such figures. From violent rivalries with political adversaries to scapegoating mechanisms against minorities. From the readiness to sacrifice innocent victims, including children, to aggressive anti-immigration policies that deprive victims of basic human rights, to the threat of nuclear wars that threaten to escalate to extremes, I think it is safe to say that the central mimetic mechanism René Girard described in his influential books from Mensonge romantique et vérité romanesque to Achevé Clausewitz can no longer be considered only as part of a theory of the violent origins of culture. It remains that. In a mirroring inversion of perspectives, mimetic theory now directly informs contemporary political practices that, as Girard sensed in his later work, are currently accelerating our progress towards potentially, but not inevitable, catastrophic destinations. There are thus ample reasons to justify a mimetic approach to contemporary politics, especially since politics was not one of Girard's main area of investigation. And Wolfgang Palaver, Roberto Farneti, and others have recently shown the relevance of mimetic theory to account for what they call mimetic politics. This applies to fascist politics as well. For instance, it is well known that fascist leaders, old and new, appeal to emotions rather than reason, pathos rather than logos, in order to generate an enthusiastic frenzy among potential voters assembling what used to be called a crowd. Robert Paxton, in The Anatomy of Fascism, perceptively diagnoses the emotional lava that set fascism foundations. These affective foundations, he continues, include the sense of overwhelming crisis, the belief that one group is a victim, the desire for a purer community, the belief in the superiority of the leader's instinct, and above all, the right of the chosen people to dominate others. Among other distinctive features, which he specifies, belong more to the realm of visceral feelings than to the realm of reasoned propositions. More recently, critics like Timothy Snyder and William Connolly convoke the visceral register of hypnosis, trance, and affective contagion to account for the contaminating power of these feelings, that is, psychological concepts that are constitutive of mimetic theory as well. What we can add is that the contagious and hypnotic nature of these feelings has been diagnosed in detail well before the rise of fascist movements in the 20s and 30s. The paradigm of hypnosis to account for mimetic contagion was in the air in fin de siècle Europe. Advocates of the newly founded discipline of crowd psychology, such as Gustave Le Bon and Gabriel Tarde in France, wanted to account for a psychological change that overcame people assembled in a crowd. Otherwise rational individuals, they observed, were suddenly easily affected by emotions, especially violent emotions, that would spread contagiously and in this sense mimetically in the crowd. As Gustave Le Bon puts it in Psychologie des foules, published in 1895, I quote, "In a crowd, every feeling, every act is contagious. Tout acte est contagieux." Note that it doesn't say tout désir, but the acts and contagious emotions he speaks of include desire. And to make the link with imitation clear, he adds, imitation, a phenomenon which is considered so influential on social behavior, is a simple effect of contagion. Now, given that Girard is one of the few contemporary thinkers who has furthered the connection between mimesis and contagion, the relation between mimetic theory and crowd psychology should be obvious, direct, and well-established. But with some exceptions, and Jean-Pierre Dupuy is one of the major ones, this genealogy is relatively little explored. I suggest that there are at least 3 reasons for pursuing it. First, crowd psychology emerges in critical dialogue with emerging social sciences such as sociology, anthropology, and psychoanalysis. That is, human sciences central to mimetic theory as well. Second, both perspectives share an interest in challenging a solipsistic view of subjectivity in order to call attention to the relational, affective, and interpersonal power of mimetic affects, including violent affects. And third, both are in line with a pre-Freudian theory of the unconscious that is not based on a repressive or Oedipal hypothesis, but on a mimetic or contagious hypothesis, attentive to mirroring reflexes that are currently returning on the theoretical scene. I group these involuntary mirroring reflexes that open the ego to external influences under the rubric of the mimetic unconscious, to differentiate it from the psychoanalytical variant, but also to indicate that imitation might provide a more direct door to access the unconscious, both at the personal and collective level. These are but some of the reasons I adopt a Janus-based perspective to bring the insights of mimetic theory into closer collaboration with the insights of crowd psychology and vice versa. Let us briefly recall that crowd psychology is a discipline that emerged in the last decades of the 19th century, specifically to study the mimetic and contagious behavior of crowds in increasingly populated cities. And these are 2 of the classics in France. There are many others in England and in Germany, but I'll stick to the case of France. Not to sound as old-fashioned as the cover of these old books in my approach to new fascism, let me mention that after a period of marginalization, crowd psychology is recently receiving renewed attention in social theory. It also deserves recognition in mimetic theory, for it adds a political perspective that could be more foregrounded. And it has been foregrounded at this conference quite a lot. The laws of imitation, in fact, are psychological in nature, but the founders of crowd psychology were quick to sense the direct political applications. Both Le Bon and Tard, in fact, pointed out that leaders, meneurs, rely on mimetic contagion in order to cast a spell on the psychic life of crowds. Comparing the power of prestigious leaders to the power of hypnotists, they drew from a psychological tradition that was attentive to the power of unconscious imitation to introduce collective sameness in place of individual differences. And we heard about sameness and difference this morning already. In particular, they relied on the notion of suggestion, la suggestion, understood as a psychological propensity to unconsciously or semi-consciously mimic gestures and expressions of others, and thus adopt by a form of contagion their ideas and opinions, especially those of respected, dominant, or prestigious others. Not unlike mimetic theory, then, crowd psychology does not set up a flattering narcissistic picture to the psychic life of the ego in a crowd. It is perhaps also for this reason that even in a post-romantic period in which originality has been proved to be a mensonge, as Girard puts it, its major insights tend to be ignored. Le Bon summarizes the major psychological characteristic of the crowd as follows. Dissolution of conscious personality, dominance of the unconscious personality, la personnalité inconsciente, orientation by way of suggestion and contagion of feelings and ideas toward the same direction. Tendency to transform suggested ideas immediately into actions. These are the principal characteristics of the individual who is part of a crowd. He is no longer himself, but an automaton, whose will no longer has the power to lead. This is indeed a troubling image, not only for the mimetic psychology it presupposes, but also for the politics it can lead to. If we take this diagnostic of the mimetic crowd literally, the politics that ensues can in fact be potentially complicit with, rather than critical of, fascism, insofar it can be used to justify the need to provide the body politic with a meneur, duce, or Führer, this being Mussolini and Hitler's translations of Le Bon's meneur. They'd read him. It would be useless to deny it. The shadow of fascist politics haunts crowd psychology, if only because this mimetic psychology was put into practice by fascist leaders. Considered from a political perspective, then Le Bon is far from being the most obvious candidate to convoke in a critique of fascist behavior. Be it old or new, is conservative politics, is fear of the specter of socialism rather than of fascism, and above all, is openly racist, sexist, and classist assumptions of crowds as feminine, primitive, savage, and so on, contribute to the pathologies of exclusion we are denouncing and deserve to be diagnosed in terms of what I called, in the context of an account of a tale that has haunted me for a long time, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, mimetic racism. That is, the ethnocentric tendency to project the shared burden of mimetic irrational behavior onto subaltern racial others so as to better justify their violent exploitation, exclusion, and subordination. And we have heard about that today quite a bit. Clearly, the horror Conrad denounced with respect to colonial leaders who are hollow at the core at the heart of Africa is now returning to haunt neoliberal Europe and the West more generally. The moral darkness is pervasive like a halo of a moon and is rendered visible in the way we continue to treat others, from children detention camps in the US to anti-immigration policies in Europe and beyond that lead to what Conrad would have probably designated as grove of death or catastrophic crossings that generate unspeakable horrors, and we've seen this image already. This is indeed a contemporary manifestation of what Conrad called the heart of darkness. To return to Le Bon, then, his racist, sexist, and nationalist accounts of crowds that demonize others will certainly not serve as our political guide in the diagnostic of the pathologies of exclusion internal to neo-fascism. And yet, we should not hasten to throw out the baby of crowd psychology with the conservative political waters in which it was born, at least if we want to understand how a mimetic affect or pathos, be it desire, fear, anger, or ressentiment, can be used to manipulate public opinion contra vulnerable others. The fact that we radically disagree with Le Bon's political conclusions against crowds as savage and pathological does not mean that we should reject his patho-logical insights into crowd behavior tout court. Le Bon had, in fact, identified distinctive rhetorical mechanisms that fascist leaders will soon use to trigger mimetic contagion in the crowd, mimetic mechanisms that are particularly useful to foster a politics of exclusion. They include, among other things, the power of repetition, the effective role of gestures and facial mimicry, the use of images rather than thoughts, of concise affirmations rather than rational explanations, the adoption of an authoritarian tone and posture, and the reliance on racial discrimination as a factor of hierarchical differentiation, all of which is specified have the power to, I quote, impress the imaginations of crowds. And with the benefit of hindsight, we should add of authoritarian leaders as well. As Le Bon puts it, the crowd being only impressed by excessive feelings, the orator who wants to seduce it must rely excessively on violent affirmations, des affirmations violentes, exaggerating, affirming, repeating, and never attempting to demonstrate anything through reason. Now, Hitler is not the same as Mussolini, who is certainly not the same as Trump. Sometimes the analogy is tricky. The latter, despite the joke, seriously, the latter is not a Nazi, it's not even a fascist, but a phantom or a shadow of a fascist. And their mimetic posture, though, and the rhetoric especially, is quite similar. So I was interested in establishing the genealogical connection, not to make facile analogies that we are returning to the past, to the 20s, but the rhetoric of fascist leaders, and Trump is an example, neo-fascist leaders, is kind of eerily similar. Of particular importance is the repetition of a simple nationalist slogan, say, "A country made great again," accompanied by a captivating and clear image, say, "a wall," and the magic of simple accusation, say, "rapist," that already sets up an imaginary but rather effective border in the mind of voters, dividing insider and outsider, self and other, us and them. The effectiveness of this rhetoric has not been popular in the second half of the past century, dominated by the linguistic turn. But the rhetoric of fascist exclusions continue to cast a spell on the present century, receptive to mimetic returns. And I speak of a mimetic turn. I think this is a good moment to advocate mimetic theory. There is a return of attention to embodiment and affect and contagion, and it's visible everywhere. It is thus useful to note that Le Bon was not alone in his diagnostic of the irrational side of the crowd. He was simply the most popular divulgator. Before Le Bon, in his sociological classic, Les lois de l'imitation, Gabriel Tarde provided sociological foundations to the connection between imitation and crowd behavior, stretching to define not only the crowd, but society as a whole in terms of contagious imitation. While politically moderate, Tarde's diagnostic of imitation was no less severe, for he extends the laws of imitation from the crowd to society as a whole. Thus, he defines the social group as a collective of individuals who are imitating each other, insofar as their common traits are ancient copies of the same model. And stressing the role of unconscious imitation, l'imitation inconsciente, in the formation of the social bond, he specifies having only suggested ideas and believing them spontaneous. This is the illusion proper to the somnambulism and to the social man. Like Le Bon, then, Tarde relies on the psychological notion of hypnotic suggestion in order to account for the mimetic tendency of social beings to adopt ideas, including racist ideas, that are originally external to the self, as one's own, as if in a kind of somnambulistic sleep. Again, the image is not flattering, but doesn't mean that it is false. Crowd psychology confirms mimetic theory as it urges us to consider that our ideas, emotions, opinions, and goals might not always be as original as they appear to be. So it's not only a question of desire. Crowd psychology is introducing the idea that we are suggestible at the level of the thoughts and political behavior that we embody. They may at least be partially shaped mimetically, hypnotically, and thus unconsciously by the models or leaders that surround us. Joining the insights of mimetic theory and crowd psychology, I call this pre-Freudian unconscious the mimetic unconscious. It designates a relational, embodied, and intersubjective unconscious that does not set up a clear split between self and other, the personal and the collective, consciousness and the unconscious. Rather, it calls attention to different degrees of consciousness that are at play as we mimic others, often without being fully conscious of doing so, and in this sense, unconsciously. Since it has hypnotic forms of imitation, perhaps more than repressed desires, as a via regia, the mimetic unconscious does not rest on a repressive hypothesis, but on a mimetic hypothesis instead. As we move from the crowd to unconscious imitation, a second genealogical connection is now in order to further our diagnostic of the pathologies of exclusion. And I move to the second part of my talk with two figures that should be familiar: suggestion and desire, Freud to Girard. At first sight, fin de siècle statements about hypnotic crowds could indeed be seen as a product of a past generation of social theorists who relied on the old-fashioned and long disproved model of suggestion to account for the power of leaders. This view is much influenced by Sigmund Freud, who was himself a theorist of crowd behavior. In Group Psychology and Analysis of the Ego, published in 1921, the father of psychoanalysis in fact dismissed hypnotic suggestion as a magical concept that explains everything and was itself to be exempt from explanation. My sense is that Freud's metapsychology, with its focus on triangular desire that leads to rivalry and violence, continues to latently influence mimetic theory. Despite its many merits, it might also restrict our understanding of the unconscious to individual complexes, and by doing so, cast a shadow on mirroring intersubjective reflexes constitutive of what I call the mimetic unconscious. Let us take a closer look. Freud's diagnostic of what he called crowd psychology, which is a better translation than group psychology, the German title is Massenpsychologie, rests on the shoulders of the tradition in crowd psychology we have just considered. In fact, Freud explicitly echoed Le Bon's and Tart's question as he asked, why do we invariably give way to this contagion when we are in a group? The answer, however, proved originally different. Freud, in fact, broke with the mimetic tradition which had suggestion as a main door to the unconscious by establishing a distinction between two emotional ties, Gefühlbindungen, that bind the crowd to the leader, most notably desire and identification, or, as Freud also puts it, wanting to have as opposed to wanting to be the other. Schematically put, Freud stretched his personal Oedipal psychology to account for crowd psychology via three structurally related theoretical steps. First, he posits that love, wanting to have, is what constitutes the essence of the group mind, in the sense that members of the crowd love the leader, just as members of an army love their commanders and members of the church love Christ. Hence the primacy of desire, object catexis. Second, he complicates his account by inserting a second emotional tie, namely identification, wanting to be, by saying in a more recognizably mimetic language that, I quote, identification endeavors to mold a person's own ego after the fashion of the one that has been taken as a model. Hence, mimesis turns out to be part of group formation as well. And finally, it triangulates these two emotional ties by stating that identification is based on the possibility or desire of putting oneself in the same situation. Desire, in other words, comes first, for it paves the way for identification or mimesis. Wanting to have what the model has leads to wanting to be the model. So far, so good. But we might also wonder, is it perhaps the other way around? This is indeed Girard's fundamental question, as you will remember in Violence and the Sacred. In a chapter titled Freud and the Oedipus Complex, Girard zeroes in on a structural ambivalence in Freud's metapsychology, thereby aligning mimetic theory with the tradition of crowd psychology that concerns us. Again, very schematically, his move is double. On the one hand, Girard points out that Freud posits the primacy of desire or object catexis over identification or mimesis. On the other hand, he also notices that Freud sometimes defines identification as the earliest expression of an emotional tie with another person, as in group psychology. Which version is true? As Girard argued, Freud saw the path of mimetic desire stretching out before him and deliberately turned aside. In Girard's exploration of the path Freud saw but did not pursue, it is in fact because the subject of the crowd identifies with the model qua leader first that he or she ends up desiring what he desires, in a move that paves the way for mimetic rivalry. Hence, in Girard's view, the mimetic model directs the disciple's desire to a particular object by desiring it himself. Mimesis for Girard is thus not only central to personal psychology, but to crowd psychology as well, for it accounts for the contagious violence that triggers mob behavior and for the scapegoating mechanism that unifies the social body. And I'm going quickly there. In the wake of Girard's reframing of Freud's account of crowd psychology, the problematic of identification and its link to hypnosis has been amply discussed in mimetic theory. Jean-Michel Ougorlian brought mimetic theory in connection with hypnosis, as he noticed in Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World that the hypnotic rapport is an exceptional condensation of all the potentiality of mimesis. The connection with fascist politics has also been noticed, most notably by Michael Borch-Jacobsen, who, in the Freudian subject, furthered Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe and René Girard's critique of Freud to expose the narcissistic nature of Freudian politics. As Borch-Jacobsen puts it, toward the conclusion of a detailed reading of group psychology, The leader is a narcissistic object. The group members love themselves in him. They recognize him as their master because they recognize themselves in him. Even without having read Freud, this dynamic of recognition should now be familiar. Mirroring reflections are all too visibly exploited by narcissistic leaders who are masters who turn this desire for recognition to new dramatic and political use. Now, this is the moment to recognize that crowd psychology and the mimetic unconscious it relies on allows us to add a decisive empirical supplement to this psychic genealogy in mimetic theory. In fact, crowd psychologists were already attentive to mirroring reflexes that were much neglected in the past Freudian century, but that are currently returning to the foreground in the 21st century. An important scientific discovery is in fact lending empirical support to the pre-Freudian realization that not only desire, but all affects, be they good or bad, are mimetic and generate unconscious mirroring reactions. A group of Italian neuroscientists led by Giacomo Rizzolatti and Vittorio Gallese in the 1990s discovered so-called mirror neurons in macaque monkeys, with striking implications to understand human mimetic behavior as well, including, as we shall see, political behavior. Thanks to informed collections like Scott Garrell's Mimesis and Science, it is well known to mimetic theorists that mirror neurons are motor neurons, that is, neurons responsible for motion, that fire not only when we move, but also at the site of movement, such as gestures and facial expressions performed by others. Thus, the mirror neuron system, as it is now called in humans, triggers in the subject the unconscious reflex of reproducing the gestures or expressions of others, generating mirroring effects that are not under the full control of consciousness and are, again, in this sense, unconscious. Less known is that mirror neurons are actually a rediscovery of the pre-Freudian tradition of the mimetic unconscious, a minor tradition that postulated already in the 1890s, that is a century before the discovery of mirror neurons, an innate tendency to imitate in the nervous system. I discussed this in detail elsewhere, but for a purpose suffices to quote Tart's untimely realization that in the nervous system, this is Tart, there is an innate tendency to imitate. Il y a dans le système nerveux une tendance innée à l'imitation. Along similar lines, Nietzsche speaks of a type of non-linguistic communication that is based on the unconscious mimicry of gestures and expressions. As he says in an 1888 fragment of Will to Power, one communicates movements, mimic signs, which we then trace back to thoughts. So he's already postulating the idea that movements and facial expressions can generate thoughts that are not based on linguistic communication, but an embodied communication. Embodied simulation of, as Vittorio Gallese now calls it. This mimetic power or pathos to cross the boundary between self and others on the basis of mimicry includes desire, but also stretches to encompass all affects, be they good or evil. And since mimetic pathos opens the ego to the outside, again for better and worse, the mimetic unconscious is not simply a personal or intersubjective unconscious, it is already a political unconscious. Mirroring mechanisms that are not under the full control of rational consciousness can in fact be linked to rationality, logical understanding, and sympathy, as neuroscientists often point out. And yet they can also provide a breeding ground for irrational misunderstandings, not to speak of deception, manipulation, and violence against others, as mimetic theory reminds us. New fascist leaders may thus not promote logical understanding in their speeches, and yet they sure know how to use mimetic pathos to make mirror neurons fire with their gestures and expressions. It is this mimetic pathos and the unconscious pathologies it triggers, I contend, that not only played a role in the election of an apprentice president, it also triggered imaginary but quite effective hierarchical distinctions between us and them, inside and outside, self and others, from which the pathologies of exclusion draw their affective and infective energy. And I come here to the last section titled The Apprentice Exclusions, from reality show to political reality. And if you haven't seen The Apprentice, don't worry, it's like the presidency. It's a question of endless chain of firings. If we now return to the present On the joint shoulders of mimetic theory and crowd psychology, it is apparent that the mimetic unconscious played a key role in the 2016 election of Donald Trump. In times of identity crisis, economic instability, political turmoil, and last but not least, environmental catastrophe, this mechanism is likely to remain center stage in the rise of new fascist leaders who can promote simple scapegoating mechanism to give the illusion to solve complex political issues. The case of Trump is just a singular case, and others could be taken, but it surprised many. Let us thus replay some scenes of this show in slow motion in light of the genealogy we mapped so far to be prepared for the future, and elections are coming up soon. Trump's rhetoric is emotionally effective because it does not simply report a political program from a rational distance. Rather, he aggressively impersonates his role with mimetic pathos that triggers the mimetic unconscious. Here are some gestures. Thus, when Trump condemns the media as fake, pointing at them as if he could fire them, or when he induces fear of minorities by calling them rapists, or when he convokes the image of a wall raising his hand to protect the nation from the so-called caravan of immigrants, or when he performatively proclaims the ban of Muslims, when he does these things, he speaks as what Nietzsche would call an actor. Or, as Plato would have put it, he speaks in a mimetic rather than diegetic register, impersonating his role in his speech, but also body, mimicry, and gestures. Consequently, this rhetoric should be taken seriously not only for what it says, the message and the ultranationalism, racism, militarism, and anti-immigration policies it conveys, but also for how he says it. The medium and the use of gestures, expressions, shouts, it mediates. A mimetic mass medium that communicates pathos directly by effective contagion to the mimetic unconscious of an already aroused crowd. In addition to Trump's embodiment of traditional elements of the American dream, his mediatized persona, staged in TV shows like The Apprentice, is also likely to have amplified his power of mimetic fascination in the sphere of fiction among the public first, thereby paving the way for his political success in the crowds of supporters as well. When I first saw this image, I was in the US, and there is no way that is going to appeal, and yet there is an appeal in that Apprentice show. So that's why I started to study how it's constructed. In guise of conclusion, I consider The Apprentice for a genus-based reason. First, to further our diagnostic of the pathologies of exclusion in the age of actors turned masters. And second, as a case study to revisit the classical psychoanalytical distinction between identification and desire, whose triangular structure continues to inform mimetic desire as well, albeit in an inverted form. Of course, Girard is critical of the Freudian model. I articulate my suspicion as innocently as possible, but the answers may have important consequences for the future of mimetic theory. Does the structural opposition between desire and mimesis still apply in the digital age? Or does it require new foundations in a mirroring pathos at play in the mimetic unconscious? What is certain is that in The Apprentice, mimesis is center stage, for identification is at least double, as it operates both inside the show and outside, in the real world. Inside the show, the carefully selected candidates that tightly fit normative standards of beauty, conform to aggressive neoliberal values, radical individualism, ruthless ambition, competitive rivalry, and so on, and serve as models that attract identification of viewers outside the show as well. Spectators of The Apprentice must in fact have a desire to be like the potential apprentices, and, as in all agonistic context, are likely to identify with one of the two competing teams. So it's two teams competing against each other based on a progress of elimination. And yet, since these competing candidates are themselves subjects motivated by the desire to be a successful business person, of which Trump sets himself up as an ideal, a hierarchy of models is already in place that situates spectators at two removes from the ideal model. The mimetic logic is simple, hierarchical, and effective. Spectators identify with the apprentices who identify with the master. From such a distance, the spectator's mimetic pathos is first and foremost shared with the apprentice candidates and their efforts to fulfill a given business-related task. This identification, however, is limited. It usually lasts until the much-coveted spectacle at the culmination of each episode, As the losing team needs to face the boardroom chaired by Trump in order to account for their failure, a predictable quasi-sacrificial turn ensues. The members of the team usually gang up against a single and rather arbitrary victim and designate a scapegoat. Responsibility for violence is thus structurally located within the mimetic team, thereby clearing the way for the sacrificer, in all good consciousness, to point his finger and pull the trigger of his notoriously symbolic execution expressed with pathos, "You're fired." The desire of the candidate to become an apprentice millionaire in a materialist-oriented culture that promotes models like Trump is, of course, not original. It is dictated by real and fictional models that are already pervasive in the culture and are visibly at play in shows like The Apprentice. That this desire leads to rivalry, not with the mediator as such, or remains at the superior level of what Girard calls external mediation, but with the other members of the team is equally inevitable given the rivalrous dimension of the show based on a process of progressive elimination itself modeled on the competitive structure of neoliberal capitalism. Hence, the need for a violent exclusion already emerges from within the rivalrous community. It's a basic and rather crude strategy of survival that allows the firing to be directed against what Girard calls a single victim that can be substituted for all the potential victims. The spectators enjoy watching such a show, that spectators enjoy watching such a show is itself confirmation of the public appeal for violence in which one or more victims are fired, allowing the other members of the team to continue the show, at least until the next firing takes place. The dynamic perfectly conforms to the Girardian schema. The desire for the same object inevitably leads to rivalry, violence, and ultimately sacrifice as a cathartic resolution for the spectators to enjoy at a distance. It is in fact difficult to find a clearer and most condensed illustration of Girard's mimetic theory. At the same time, and without contradiction, we may also wonder, who is the you who's being fired here? And why should spectators identify with the sacrificer in the first place? Here, the pathological dynamic of exclusion is less clear, but might allow us to further our diagnostic of the mimetic unconscious. Within the show, the victim is the fired apprentice, of course, but if we happen to identify with his or her position, why watch the show otherwise? There is a psychic side of the public that vicariously experiences being fired as well. The finger gun pointing at the failed apprentice, framed in a medium shot that breaks the fourth wall, comes awfully close to pointing to us as well. And as the apprentice's dream of success fails within the reality show, so do ours, at one remove from the show in real life. After the firing, then, spectators' identificatory allegiances inevitably shift from the now symbolically dead apprentice qua sacrificial victim toward the narcissistic business model qua sacrificer. An interesting mimetic shift from the failed apprentice to the ideal model has thus just taken place that cuts across the distinction between show and reality. The show, in other words, is not about the apprentice, it is about the master. Trump is visibly the original narcissistic model the apprentice is supposed to mimic within the reality show. At one remove, in reality, spectators may initially identify with the sacrificial apprentice until the firing devalues the apprentice and glorifies the power of Trump. Put in more classical terms, identification with Trump is a dramatic effect of the tragic structure or mythos of this show. Hence, a perverse desire to be Trump, to identify with the sacrificer rather than the victim, is automatically triggered by the mimetic plot of the show every time that a firing takes place, generating mimetic pathos. The show ran for 15 seasons. It was still ongoing at the time Trump decided to enter another reality TV show and run for the presidency. We were wondering why the victim identifies with the oppressor, not in reality, not only in reality, but also in political fictions. The Apprentice illustrates a perverse hyper-mimetic dynamic that is now at play in political spectacles as well. In their social reality, the working class voters who supported Trump are actually on the side of the sacrificial victims. living in miserable social conditions, deprived of basic social services, not sustained by unions, driven by fear of others, and subjected to real forms of deprivation that render their lives precarious, they're not likely to fire anyone anytime soon in real life, but can always potentially be fired instead. And paradoxically, for this reason, they are deeply impressed by the power they lack and wish to have. This mimetic paradox is then aggravated by an increasingly mediatized political world modeled on a form of aggressive, rivalrous, and violent entertainment in which it is becoming difficult to distinguish between life